Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pitt Mailbag here from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter. No Noah Hiles this week. We'll get into where Noah Hiles is in a bit here. But remember, you can always find this show and all of our shows from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on all your favorite podcasting apps by searching for Post-Gazette Sports and searching for the North Shore Drive podcast. Remember, we have daily content coming out from our podcast from here and on YouTube. By the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our daily episodes, as well as our Monday, Wednesday, and Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, where I talk all things Pittsburgh sports with all of our Pittsburgh sports writers. But let's focus on Pitt for today, and it's going to be a fun episode. Just me, but I think you guys are going to like some of the things we got to talk about today. And we got questions from all of you who were mailing in, so let's get right to it. We're going to start off with Lisa Feathers, who took to on Twitter to ask this question. Chris, give us the football breakout players on offense and defense. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you two on each side and give you why I'm giving you each of these players. So 4 players to talk about. Lisa, I hope you're happy with this answer. Now, leading with one name that everyone's kind of excited to see perk up a little bit over the next couple years, and that's Ryan Baer on the offensive line. Now, he's a redshirt freshman. He's slotted in at the tackle position. It's kind of where they're having him play. He's not going to start at the start of the season, but injuries happen to every team. There's rotations that need to happen. Guys at tackle will sometimes move to guard. Ask Matt Gonsalves. He played all over Pitt's line over his years. I think what's going to happen is there's going to be injuries, and at some point Ryan Baer is going to need to start for Pitt's offensive line. And I think that he's the next guy who's going to be on that offensive line for multiple years and be a dominant force to usher in the new young era for Pitt's offensive line. Now, I say this because a lot of Pitt's offensive line been here for a long time. Ryan Jacoby, well, he's a transfer, but he's a senior. Jake Cradle, he been here through COVID year and everything. He's out of eligibility after this season. Matt Gonsalves, a redshirt senior. Blake Zubovich, a redshirt senior. Even backups like Jason Collier Jr. is a redshirt senior. So they have a lot of guys who have experience, but a breakout guy in this offensive line would change a lot. And there was a lot of excitement over Ryan Baer being able to join Pitt when he picked them, because just his raw athleticism, I think a lot of people get excited about. He was a 4-star kid coming out of Eastlake, Ohio on Rivals. I think there's a lot to like about some of the physical dominance that Pitt's been able to amass over the years. And I think Ryan Baer is the start of the next generation when it comes to that for Pitt Panthers football. And something that happened when Noah and I were covering last year's training camp, and we were seeing practices every day, and we kind of get used to seeing who wins and who loses in certain reps. But when the ACC crew came to Pittsburgh and they were filming at the UPMC Rooney Sports Complex and watching practices, the entire ACC crew was like, this team looks a lot more physical than most teams in the ACC, and that's going to win them some key football games. And lo and behold, they won 9 games last year. So I think that Pitt is trying to keep up their reputation. And I think Ryan Baer, this past year, he came in, learned the ropes, but I think he's learned enough of the ropes that when he's going to be thrown into the mix, he's going to be physical, he's going to be ready. And I think Pitt, he's gonna earn a starting spot that makes him a starter for the foreseeable future for the Panthers. My other offensive guy, who I'll talk about here, is a person who I've mentioned a little bit on this show, but I'm going to mention again for our listeners and viewers. And that's freshman wide receiver Israel Polk. Now, I say Israel Polk, kid from Cali, because I watched him practice in the spring. And man, let me tell you, that kid was already several steps ahead of where I expect true freshmen coming in with their route tree, with knowing how to get into and out of their breaks, and being able to beat defenders at different spots and different alignments. And if you're a really, really good route runner on top of a really, really good athlete, which I think Israel Polk is, it gives you a big leg up in a lot of situations. Now, I also thought he displayed some really strong hands, and that can be deceptive in practice because things change in the game. Even Jordan Addison, his freshman year, when he was adapting to things, he looked great in practice. It took him some adjustments. He did drop some passes his freshman year, but by the time he was a sophomore, he was so far ahead of everyone else that he was blowing people away. And I'm not here to say Israel Polk is going to be Jordan Addison, but I'm here to say that kid is talented. When you watch the explosiveness from him and the footwork that he puts into just how he practices, there are promising things there. Now, the tricky thing at wide receiver is that position's quite a bit stacked. You got Konate Mumfield and Bub Means, who are already on the team, but then the team went and got Dejon Reynolds. So they've already got 3 guys who are going to be getting the majority of the pass reps. They also have a guy who's been on the team for a little bit now, Jake McConaughey, a person that I like, a person I think he can go up and get the football, and he's a guy I think that has worked really hard to get to where he is. You also have other young players on the team that are working like Izzy Polk to get that to that spot. Lamar Seymour would be on that. Addison Copeland would be on that list. Che Nwabuko, who we'll actually get to in a minute here, would be on that list. Zion Fowler. There's guys that fit that mold, but I tend to lean to Israel Polk as being a potential breakout player on offense. Why? Because of his burst, because of his route running, and that could make him the key target for the Panthers receiving core for the next few years. Let's flip to defense to finish up Lisa's question here. I know I'm on this topic for a bit, but hey, bear with me. This is what happens when you don't have Noah Hiles to shut me up during a segment. 2 defensive guys. I'm going to start with one that I've talked about a lot on the show, and that's Nikai Johnson. Now, I would say Deion Hayes, but because technically we haven't seen him break out and be this player that everyone's just agreeing is just going to be a first-round pick. But I think Deion Hayes, I think enough fans saw him a little bit last year and have been waiting for him to come up that he's kind of an obvious pick here. So I'm going to go with a not so obvious one. I'm going to pick Nikai Johnson because there's still people out there that think that Bam Brema might be the Panthers' second starting edge rusher. And that could very well be true because I like Bam Brema. I think he's a tough player. He's waited his turn. He's been there. He's worked the hard work. But Nikai Johnson, I think, is really special. He's a redshirt sophomore, and even Deion Hayes, who's now the elder of the group of defensive ends, he has said how Nikai Johnson is way ahead of where he was at his age. And when I've talked to Nikai, both, in just scrums and just hanging out, watching a Steelers practice, picking his brain, just getting to see what kind of player he is and what kind of person he is. The young man thinks. The young man carries himself well. He thinks about his future in multiple ways. And he works hard and he buys into what Charlie Partridge is selling. And that to me is one of the biggest factors is if you are buying into what this coaching staff is preaching, even if you are a 1-star recruit or a walk-on, you can find yourself being useful. But Nikai Johnson's much better than that. Nikai Johnson's a guy who I think is going to be one of those guys that gets talked about. Not this upcoming season. I think he's going to need about another year or 2, maybe even 2, before he's in that conversation as far as being draft players. Just because I think that he's going to stick with Pitt a bit longer. But this is a 4-star kid who came up in the area, played at West Mifflin, has the bill. He's 6'3", 220 plus, maybe like 230 now or something like that. And he's got a mean streak on the field, and he knows how to use it. And I'm telling you, Pitt fans, if you want a breakout player, this defensive front needs new heroes with guys like Kalijah Cansey and Habakkuk Baldonado and Desmond Alexander. All that crew, they have gone. There's still defensive tackles like Devin Danielson and David Green who are sticking around, and guys like DeAndre Jules and Tyler Bentley who have been depth players for quite some time. But while Pitt's waiting for Elliott Donald and Sean Fitzsimmons and Isaiah Neal and guys like that to work their way up, and Sam Okunlola, Nikai Johnson, I think will be not just a bridge player, but the next dominant player of the defensive line that gets all the attention along with Deion Hayes and makes it tough for offensive lines to counter Pitt. My second guy here, Javon McIntyre at safety. I like his athleticism. I like how he plays into things. I've heard some really good things from just people who evaluate young players. And when I watch him on tape and when I watched him in the spring, I like Javon McIntyre. Pitt needs some new safeties to take over with both Eric Hallett and Brandon Hill gone to the NFL. I think they've got about 4 good ones, maybe even 5, that they could happily rotate throughout their secondary in McIntyre, PJ O'Brien, Donovan McMillan, Stephon Hall, and even Buddy Mack III, who I think is a really good depth piece to have in your secondary. And I'm not even getting to the cornerbacks. I'm just talking about the safeties. I think those are all. I think that if I'm picking one guy to break out, the redshirt sophomore, Javon McIntyre, watch out for him. Let's move on here, and let's address a player that I mentioned briefly before with a question from Bill. Che Nwabuko may be the fastest on the team. Is there any sign that he sees the field this year? Bill, this is a good question. I like Che Nwabuko for his speed because he certainly is fast. He won track championships in Texas. He was known to be a speed phenom coming to Pitt last year. He's now a redshirt freshman. But I have a hard time seeing him get to see the field a lot as a wide receiver. Now, here's the thing. He was kind of known as an athlete and could bounce around a whole lot. The problem is Pitt is stacked up at running back and wide receiver with talent, I think, that will list ahead of him. Like, for example, I think that we talked about the top 3 guys, Dejon Reynolds, Bub Means, Konate Mumfield. I think that you're going to look at some of the freshman guys this year, Polk and Seymour, as 2 guys that could be the first 2 options to come off Pitt's bench if they're in the receiving game. Che Nwabuko may be right after them, but I think he's more of a straight speedster than a football speedster when it comes to route running and things like that. However, I do think he sees the field in one way, and that's as a way that I what do you call it? I call upon Pitt to actually enact this plan, because one thing that drove Noah and I crazy in the press box last year was when you see Izzy Abanikanda running for 5,000 yards on guys, and then he's taken the kickoff return, and you're like, give that kid some water and let someone else do that job. And this year, I think that Pitt needs to act in a way or deploy their special teams in a way that does not force Rodney Hammond Jr. to have to be that guy. And they need to go with a guy who's a true speedster, who's a player, who's a playmaker with the football in his hand. And that's where you find Che Nwabuko. Get him on special teams where the ball's in his hands. And if you give him one seam, that Texas track speed comes into play. Does that answer your question, Bill? That's where I see Che Nwabuko. Let's get to some funnier questions here. First, I'm going to address a question from a friend of ours, a friend of the show, and a friend in the press box. That's our man, Chris Peak from Pantherlair.com. He has a question. Where is Noah? It's a good question, Chris. Where is Noah? I was ready to have a full week of work and do my thing by doing the North Shore Drive podcast and, helping on the Pitt beat while he was holding it down, as, we kind of have our balance in the off season. But then all of a sudden, Noah's just tweets out a picture of him on an airplane. Didn't tell nobody where he was going. And then he's just gone. So now poor old Chris has just got to man the Pitt mailbag all by himself. Times is tough, man, but not for real. Noah's out there partying. He deserves it. He's a hardworking individual. And I was happy to hear that he was taking some vacation time so that I could get some time on the air by myself talking to y'all about some Pitt mailbag. But shout out to Chris Peak for getting in on the fun with some of the questions here. He's a great dude. Follow him on Twitter and his work. He's an awesome person to have out there as we in our Pitt, media core that we have there. I think we have a really strong nucleus of guys and people who report on the Pitt beat. Let's get to some other questions here. And these are some funnier questions that we're going to get to in here, because we get serious questions, but it's early July. I know some of y'all is just like, man, Chris, we don't got no questions till we start seeing people in training camp. So I feel you. So let's take some funnier questions we got here. I got Kevin, who asked me, and this is a legitimate question, which Pitt football coaches would you want by your side in a bar fight? This is a good question. I'm gonna take 2, because I feel like you gotta have one on each shoulder, right? That's how fights work. Like you walk up in the movie and you kick open the door and you're ready to scrap, and you see right behind you, you got one man on your right, one man on your left, and you're like, yo, what's up? If I had to pick 2 guys right now, I'd take Charlie Partridge, Taekwon Underwood. Charlie, because Charlie's tough. And like nobody messes with Charlie. When that man speaks, it's the big, and I've seen the biggest dudes in the world be like, huh, they listen to Charlie Partridge. And I just think that in a scrap, Charlie Partridge would have my back. He'd be throwing down and he'd be getting everybody out of the way. And like, because Charlie Partridge isn't himself. He isn't huge. He's an average sized individual. He's a well above average coach. I even say a great defensive line coach. And if you great at coaching defensive line, you have done you've done some physical things in your life. You can handle some business. So I'm going with Charlie Partridge. I'm going with Taekwon Underwood because he's got a little bit of that length, and I think that he's got quickness in his hands. So if I need some guy who's faster, a guy who got some length to keep people off me and to kind of set the tone, I can have him. So I got my bruiser and I got my quickster who's got the long hands. And then you got me. So, you know what? That's a question for Noah when he comes back. Who would he take? Because I think that me and my two would beat him and his two. Now, shout out. I do think Pat Narduzzi would be tough in a bar fight as well. The only two guys I'd say on the Pitt coaching staff who I don't think would be great in a bar fight just because of their age is Coach Borbs and Coach Powell. Coach Powell, he just like to fish. He ain't hurting nobody. And we all kind of like, hey, Andre, what's up? That's kind of how it is with him. Now, Dave Borbley, he's also kind of up there. I think that Dave Borbley back in the day, he would knock you on your butt. Now he's just the offensive line coach that kind of just keeps everybody in line. But Partridge and Underwood, also Corey Sanders, Archie Collins, those two as a pair might because they're around each other so much as secondary coaches, they could be. I think they might have some ninja tactics to them because they're around each other so much. Let me stop being silly over here. But fun question, Kevin. Thank you for that here on the Pitt Mailbag. Let's get to Sean finishing up here with the Pitt Mailbag. Sean's ramblings from Twitter asks, when is Pitt going to build an on-campus football stadium? The ultimate Pitt question that we totally never get any other time in the history of the world. No one ever asked this question. This is so unique. Sean, you deserve a medal for being the first person in history to ask this question. I can't believe I never thought of this question in my life. When will Pitt get a football stadium on campus? And here's the unique part. And now this is why I really like your question, Sean. Will there be an O stand in the new stadium? Now, addressing the overall premise here, for those who are not initiated to the situation, there is nowhere to put a Pitt football stadium in Oakland right now, little in the city. It kind of works for Acrisure Stadium / if you still call it Heinz Field, get over yourself and call it Acrisure Stadium. But it kind of works for now because they share the facility with the Steelers. I think it's a cool looking venue. You can still see the city. I think that's actually nice. Plus, let's just face it, when Pitt put the Pete up at the top of the hill instead of and took down Pitt Stadium, it was kind of a thing to that. There's no place to put a football stadium right now, at least in my mind. And listen, I say this not because they physically couldn't tear down a whole bunch of buildings in Oakland and build a Pitt football stadium, but because there'd be no way to get to it. I've had to get into the Pete while we were waiting on a late night Pitt. Like it was like Pitt and some like Nichols State or something like that. And because Pitt volleyball was in the first round of the tournament and they were playing like a few hours before, it was a gridlocked Oakland for hours. I got to the parking. I thought I'd be smart getting to the parking lot 3 hours early for the game. No, I was wrong. Took me forever to park. And heck, it was funny because I started covering Pitt in the 2020 season, which was kind of odd for me because literally no one could go to games. It was COVID. And so when I started covering Pitt for a different outlet at the time, I was going to Pete and I was like, this is the life. I get the easiest parking spot. I get to walk down to the game. I mean, the games was quiet as all get out, but it was still, it was nice for getting in and getting out. But once Pitt started winning this year, I was like, oh, snap. So this is what the Pete's like? This is what parking's like? There was one time I was running late because I had recorded a podcast segment for a game and I had to get to the Pete. And I was still about like an hour and a half before tip off. And because Noah was there, I was like, Noah, hold it down. He'll watch the warm ups. I'll get there an hour and a half. I'll be fine. I get to Forbes Avenue an hour and a half before, and there are just cars just sitting on the hill, just not budging. And the thing was that I had seen this before by now, by how many times I've covered Pitt games. And I was like, nope, I'm not doing it. I parked in Lower Oakland, walked my butt up Cardiac Hill, sweated, did all of it, was breathing like crazy, had to pull out the asthma pump, but I made it up there. And I say all this to say there's nowhere to put a stadium. They can barely handle a Fitzgerald Fieldhouse and a Peterson Events Center in Oakland right now. And you want a football stadium. It won't happen. Victory Heights will be very cool, though. I do think that'll be another thing that people will be able to manage. And maybe with Victory Heights, there'll be better parking situations. And when that happens, let's revisit this conversation. But for now, it ain't happening. Stop asking. Well, no, keep asking, because I get to make fun of make these jokes about it being an original question. However, Sean, your question was not completely devoid of importance, my friend, because you asked something that's essential. You asked, will there be an O stand in the new stadium? Now, for those who aren't familiar, the uninitiated, I know if you're a Pitt fan, you listen to this, you know about the Dirty O, the greatest hot dog store in the history of the world. It's a shame when that place closed down. My family used to go to that was a tradition of my family. When Pitt basketball was on like a Tuesday or a Thursday, and I was still in school, I'd come over, I'd pick up some dogs. I go to my dad's crib and we'd watch some Pitt hoops together. And that was just a good old tradition in the Carter family. Or sometimes when there wasn't Pitt basketball or something like that, we'd still just get maybe like once a week, twice a month, something like that. And it was a good old time. Now, Sean, this may sound crazy, but if you put an original hot dog shop in the state, I don't care. Build that stadium right now. I will personally start raising funds for a Pitt football stadium if it means we get the O back somehow. I should have worn my O shirt. I have one. I actually the owners were so nice because I would come there. They knew me and my dad, and they gave me a T-shirt before they closed. It's still somewhere in my closet over there. But I'm serious when I say this, man. I miss the O so bad. Those fries were on some other levels. If you knew the O, and see, I have to admit, I didn't know the O the way that a lot of alumni know the O, because I went to Pitt Law School I graduated in 2014. So from 2011 to 2014, I was on campus, and I already knew about the O because my family had gone there from when I was a kid. I think my Uncle Ben started to work there for a little bit when he was in like the 70s when he was around. And when I was there, I got to experience like that, but I never saw like the late night like when all the bars were closing and the O was the only thing open and people were packed into there. That I never really experienced because I heard that place was bumping. But man, I miss me some old fries. There was one time that I went to Alderdice and we went on a class trip and we got to hear like a lecture at one of the Pitt academic buildings. And I think we had like an hour to get lunch wherever we wanted in Oakland. And me and my boys was like, we going to the O, and we got the extra large fries. And like the last few years, they didn't have extra large because they was just deemed too unhealthy. But it was just these fries that was stacked up at least a foot and a half tall, just packed in together. And about like 6 of us picked at it, and we just had the greatest lunch of our lives, just French fries. That's how you know we were high schoolers. But if Heather, if you're listening, if you can get the O in a Pitt football stadium, I'm backing you. I'm donating. What we got to do to make it happen. So shout out to Sean Ramblings for bringing up the O stand. We need the O back in Oakland, man. That would be the life. We hope you enjoyed this unorthodox Pitt mailbag session here from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Thanks thanks and shout out to Lisa, Bill, Kevin, Sean, and Chris Peak for joining in on the show and getting us some questions here to entertain you on a Tuesday. I'm your host, Chris Carter here. Noah will be back next week and we'll be able to have a more complete Pitt mailbag session, but I wanted to just have some fun while we could during the off season here. Thanks again for tuning into the Pitt mailbag session from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Remember, find all of our content at post-gazette.com. Find this show, the Pitt mailbag show, as well as all of our Pittsburgh Post-Gazette podcasts on all your favorite podcasting apps by searching for Post-Gazette Sports, or you can find us on YouTube by searching the same thing, looking up the North Shore Drive podcast, a show I do Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with all our Pittsburgh sports writers as we talk about the hottest topics in the city, as well as shows like this every day throughout the week, whether it's covering Pitt, Penguins, Pirates, Steelers. We got Paul's Ice. We got a lot of different things that come out here. Check us out, subscribe to us, get all of our great content. Again, I'm your host, Chris Carter, for the Pitt mailbag. You'll see me again Wednesday talking more Pittsburgh sports on the North Shore Drive podcast, coming out of the All-Star break and getting you ready for the end of the week. We'll see you there right here from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed it on Apple Podcasts, please rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down in the description.